Texas Republicans were dealt a major blow in their efforts to revive strict voter ID requirements that were found to discriminate against minorities after the Supreme Court yesterday declined to hear their case. The court's decision means a July ruling by a lower court will stand. That ruling by the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals found the law had a discriminatory effect and violated the U.S. Voting Rights Act. The law, passed in 2011 by a Republican-led legislature and signed by a Republican governor, had been considered one of the strictest in the country. The Justice Department, under former President Barack Obama, challenged the Texas statute, charging it made it harder for mostly Democratic minorities to vote. In a statement following the court's decision, Republican Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton vowed to keep fighting. Quote, Texas enacted a common-sense voter ID law to safeguard the integrity of our elections, Paxton said, and we will continue to fight for the law in the district court, the Fifth Circuit, and if necessary, the Supreme Court again. Now, folks, what's also interesting about this, last night Donald Trump met with congressional leaders and revived the lie that upwards of 5 million people voted illegally in this election. Now, here's what's interesting about this. So I'm driving in this morning. The folks on Morning Joe were talking about it. And Joe Scarborough was saying, oh, well, look, we can focus on this. A New York Times headline is really no big deal. I mean, but we can focus on the policy yesterday. But here's the missing piece. What Trump said leads to policy, leads to more bills like that in Texas. Let's break it down. Dr. Avis Jones-DeWeaver, a leadership strategist, also author of the book. Show the book, please. How Exceptional Black Women Lead. All right, y'all had a book? Okay. Thank you very much. Please show Avis's book so we can sell her some copies. Thank you very much, folks. All right, how Exceptional Black Women Lead. Our then Steve Munisteri, former chairman of the Republican Party of Texas, and Dr. Bill Spriggs, chief economist for the AFL-CIO and professor of economics at Howard University. All right, folks, this is the thing that trips me out, Steve. Let's go here first. Here Republicans trying to push this bill through, strict ID. And what's shameful in Texas, my home state, is that it's easier for you. You can use a gun license to register to vote. But if you are a student at a Texas university, there's a state school, at Texas A&M, Texas Tech, University of Houston, all the others, you can't use a student ID. And for the Supreme Court to kick this back, this is a blow to this voter ID law in Texas.
Well, first of all, I was the state chairman that actually pushed the voter ID bill, so I think I know a little bit about it. And since you're from Texas, you know we have a long history of voter fraud going back to the Johnson-Nixon. While I was state chairman, the courts threw out the elections in Weslaco, Texas for voter fraud. When I came into the building this morning, they made me show a voter ID. I don't think it's unreasonable to make sure that people who vote are actually who they say they are. And
but it's unreasonable when you require folks to go to the Department of Public Safety, where in some of those locations, they are literally miles and miles away. And again, when you also put other nuances in that particular bill that also make it even more difficult.
All right, but what you're not adding is that the Department of Public Safety had mobile vans that went into neighborhoods, and if you requested an ID, you got one free.
So why did the courts rule against them?
The reason why the courts ruled against them, and let me point out that the Fifth Circuit, both in the 3-panel judge and then en banc, meaning all of them, both ruled that there was no discriminatory intent. What it simply said was that there are 5% of voters that don't have an ID, so therefore the measures were not adequate. So you need to come up with adequate measures. They have not thrown out the law. The Supreme Court...
But 5% matters in an election.
It does.
5% is a huge number.
It does. So there are remedies that the lower court can do to keep the law in effect, but have modifications. So, for example, I personally think student IDs should be allowed. If you're not...
So why do Republicans in Texas not do it?
I'll tell you. The reason was that not all the schools are public schools, so not all the IDs would have been government IDs.
Yeah, no, but here's the deal, though. I get that. But the reality is there are other states that actually pass voter ID laws where state institutions, which are state IDs, state issue IDs. I had one as a student at Texas A&M, that even at least at those universities, which actually are the larger universities in the state, they said no. Other states said yes.
Right.
Texas said no.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you on that because I agree with you on that.
Right. I just find it laughable.
One possible remedy is
okay.
that you allow that. They also need to make them more available through the mobile program. So right now, there are mobile IDs mobile vans that actually go in and give you a free ID if you ask for it. So what Justice Roberts took the unusual step yesterday of saying, we're only not listening to this because the lower court hasn't finished its work.
Avis?
I think that, and he did. That was very unusual. And frankly, I think that was a nod and a wink to Republicans to say, bring this back when we have a clear majority on this court. The reality is what's going on here is very much discriminatory. The reality is that we know that whites are more likely to have gun licenses in Texas than are people of color. One simple answer to that is that I am encouraging black people and other people in Texas and other people of color in Texas to get a gun license if that's going to be okay. But beyond that, we know definitely that this is something that was discriminatory. It's something that we've seen sort of mirrored all over the nation. And it's sad to see that when we have a nation that's built on this sort of fundamental right of being able to vote and being able to voice your vote as a citizen of the United States, that instead of having a party that looks to expand that right, over and over again, we see multiple instances of trying to shrink it in order to sway the electorate in a way that helps those individuals who we know are undergoing a demographic decline.
Bill.
Well, I think that this is another indication of the Republican Party running itself into being a dinosaur. It's being totally tone deaf to expanding and reaching out to communities that currently think it's hostile. And then they do things like this, which are hostile. It's a tax on poor people. Whether you make it free, whether you come into my neighborhood, you are asking me to do another step, another hurdle to vote. We don't have the highest voter participation of the democracies. Our nation should be ashamed of this level of participation. Instead of putting barriers in the way, instead of saying, here's another hurdle, we should be having around-the-clock voting. We should have the day off. It should be a state holiday. We should be making it easier. Every time you add another barrier, you add another hurdle, you decrease voter participation. It's not.
Now, Steve, it was interesting again when I made the point about Trump talking to congressional leaders yesterday, talking about, oh, there were 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast. Where's the proof? Where's the proof? See, it's interesting to me when we talk about, so you just said this law says that 5% of the people disenfranchised. What's the percentage of voter fraud in Texas? What is it? What's the actual data?
There haven't been any studies on that.
No, hold on. That's not true. The governor of Texas, Abbott, stood there and said, oh, we've had massive voter fraud. Well, he was the former attorney general.
But I'll tell you why.
There literally were 1 or 2 cases he could only cite.
Yeah, well, hold on a second. There were dozens of cases when he was AG. But let me tell you a story.
No, hold on. No.
But there hasn't been a study to show how many votes actually were fraudulent. The only time you find out is fraudulent is if you actually have a challenge. But
but Steve, here's my point.
Roland, can I tell you a story?
Hold on. You can tell the story in a second. If 5% of the people in Texas disenfranchised, that's 600,000. Are you telling me that Texas has no data to back up the allegations of voter fraud? And again, I want to know how much. I mean, just give me a number. If you say that we have instances where there were 500,000 ballots cast that were cast illegally, what's the number?
All right. Well, first of all, on the 600,000, those are people that they did a database that has to match exactly correctly. So if you have a different middle initial, it will show you didn't have an ID. But let me tell you a story.
Hold up, Steve. Before you tell the story, I'm going to ask a question again. All right, where is the evidence of massive voter fraud in Texas?
I won't use the word massive. I will say that there's voter fraud that affects elections.
How much?
I just gave you an example.
Give me a number.
Well, I'll just tell you, in Weslaco, Texas, all the elections were thrown out while I was state chairman because the judge found that there was a massive amount of voter fraud in that particular election. So there's not massive fraud in every election, but you have instances of voter fraud. So let me tell you the story.
Hold up. According to the Texas Tribune, Texas prosecuted 15 illegal voting cases. 15. So you telling me that the entire state of Texas, the entire state, needs this strict voter ID law because of 15 out of all the elections, out of all of the local, all of the state, all of the congressional, all the presidential. 15?
What you're missing, Roland, is someone has to make a complaint for there to be an investigation. That doesn't mean you don't have voter fraud in other areas. So let me tell you the story as to why I'm so passionate about this. I worked as a voter fraud investigator in the Ron Paul, Bob Gamage voter fraud case. And what Ron Paul did was, after he lost the election, he sent a thank you letter to everybody that had supposedly voted. Thousands, and not hundreds, thousands came back, deceased, no such person. I went into the field and personally checked out hundreds of those and found vacant lots voted. I found gas stations voted. I found people who've been there for a year. That election was decided by 263 votes. I'm absolutely convinced that election was stolen. That's where my passion comes from.
This is what the Texas Tribune wrote. Shelley, go pull up my iPad. Quote, Texas officials claim that the law is needed to prevent fraud, but only 15 cases have been prosecuted by the Office of the Attorney General of Texas between the 2012 primary election and July of this year, according to a News 21 review of more than 360 allegations the office received in that time. 11 of those 15 cases dealt with people hired by local candidates in predominantly Latino communities to collect in mail ballots for mostly elderly voters. 15 cases in 4 years.
So, Roland, should we ignore the Weslaco problem?
Should we ignore 600,000 people?
No.
And
that's make sure it's very, very easy for them.
And guess what, Steve? That's not happening. What's not happening? It didn't happen in Wisconsin. So, hold on, Steve. In Wisconsin this year, a federal judge hauled them into the office and said, "Why are you dragging your feet?" They said voter ID was legal, but the state of Wisconsin was purposely being slow in even mailing out the voter ID. Not just black people, but elderly whites, Latinos as well. We saw it. We've seen it in other states where all of a sudden, oh no, you must have a raised birth certificate. You can't get the one from the Bureau of Vital Statistics. No, it has to have a raised birth certificate. Then in Pennsylvania, where they passed the voter ID law, and they said, quote, "We're passing this for voter fraud." Yet, when they got sued, the Attorney General filed a paperwork with the court and said, "We have no proof of voter fraud in Pennsylvania." So my problem is when someone says, "We're doing this for voter fraud," and they can't present the evidence, but then they say, "Yeah, but we know it kind of happens out there."
Well, Columbia University did a study nationwide looking at this issue between 2000 and 2004. Out of 1 billion votes cast, only about 30 instances of impersonations that might be considered voter fraud. Out of 1 billion votes cast. That is a statistical anomaly.
Yeah, but
so the reason to take away people's constitutional rights because of statistical anomaly, to me, is nefarious at best. It is not in an American. It is not in someone who's really interested in a democracy. It's really about being able to protect your own political power when you know your demographics are going against your future.
The problem with those studies is nobody went to those 1 billion votes and checked every vote. It's only when there are complaints. As I said, I've seen it up close. But Roland, let me agree with you on something. I don't think there should be unreasonable barriers. I think we should try to get as many people to vote. So, for example, I agree with you on the student ID. And if we don't have voter ID, then at the very least, I want people to be able to bring a utility bill or something to show that who are.
But here's the deal. Republicans aren't doing that. They aren't doing North Carolina. They're not doing it in Wisconsin. Now they're trying to introduce a voter ID bill in Iowa, trying to introduce one in Michigan. The reality is this here, as we know with these elections, Republicans are looking to shave off votes in these various places by presenting voter ID, and they don't have the evidence. And what I don't like is when they lie. In Pennsylvania, they lied. They literally said they passed a law because of voter fraud, yet when they went to the federal courts, there was no proof of voter fraud, and they even said it in their own documents. And my deal is, don't lie. And that's what they're doing. Donald Trump lied last night, saying 3 to 5 million legal votes were cast. No proof. Not falsehood. It's a flat-out lie. And what I'm saying is, if Republicans want anybody to give them any credit, you better present actual evidence, but they must stop lying. and they're lying.
Well, Roland, I agree with you. There's no evidence that there's 5 million in voter fraud, and
That's a lie.
I can't speak to other states. I can just speak to Texas, where I was one of the people pushing for voter ID.
I'm telling
and
you.
I told you the reason why was because of my experience.
I'm telling you right now, you need more than 15 cases. If you're going to screw 600,000 people, I think you need a little bit more than 15 cases.
But should we ignore? But you never have
Voter
answered.
ID is not the solution to what you claimed happened. You are saying that votes were cast by people who didn't exist. So that's not voter ID.
No.
That does not get solved with voter ID. You said.
You're right.
That there were empty lots.
Right.
You said
but
they were dead people.
there was a name of a real person there. If they had ID, that person would have shown up. You're wrong. You're wrong, sir.
You can't get a vote
I was there. I saw it.
You can't get a vote from an empty lot.
Yes, you can. If there had been a person that had lived there.
Voter ID does not solve that problem.
It does. Because
it doesn't solve that problem.
If Bill Bell had lived in that...
It doesn't solve that problem.
You're wrong, sir.
It doesn't solve that problem.
You're wrong. Let me explain why. If you had an empty lot that had a house there 10 years earlier and Bill Bell lived there, and then somebody shows up and says they're Bill Bell and votes, a voter ID would have. You can't tell me what I saw. I went door to door as a volunteer.
I'm telling you what it solves, and it doesn't solve that problem.
It does, because you had.
It doesn't solve that problem.
You had people impersonating. It solves the impersonation problem. I found impersonation. Tell me how voter ID does not help with impersonation.
It doesn't solve that problem. That means that you have people colluding at the booth. That's something else you need to solve. You're going after the wrong person. Look, on regulations, Republicans yell and scream about regulations, but you put a regulation on poor people to vote. And where are you? You're trying to put more regulations on them to vote.
So let me ask you,
you're trying to put more costs on them.
Hold tight.
Kickstart your day at 7 and get the news you need from the perspective you want. News 1 Now with Roland Martin. Every weekday morning at 7 on TV 1.